I sank into the plush car seat, my muscles still weak from the long week I had spent in the hospital. The air outside was cool, the late afternoon sun casting golden hues across the windshield. My breath hitched slightly as I saw him, my nephew, Julian, stepping out of his car, the sharp lines of his jaw catching the light. He wasn't the boy I used to take to theme parks or playgrounds anymore. He was a man now. "Aunt Sophia," he said warmly, opening the car door for me. His voice carried that confident yet gentle tone, the kind that made you feel safe. He leaned in, one strong arm gently supporting me as I slid into the passenger seat. "You good?" I nodded, though I wasn't sure if the flutter in my chest was from my weak body or something else entirely. "Thank you, Julian. I don't know what I'd do without you." The scent of his cologne wafted through the air as he closed my door and made his way to the driver's side. For a moment, I let my eyes linger on him. The way his broad shoulders stretched the fabric of his shirt, the way he carried himself like someone who had seen too much too soon. And in a way he had. When he settled into the driver's seat and started the car, I turned my gaze out the window, trying to ground myself. The hum of the engine vibrated beneath me as the silence between us thickened, comfortable yet charged. I thought back to when Julian was younger, a giggling boy with boundless energy who used to run to me with scraped knees and wild stories about imaginary dragons. But now, at 20, he was composed, collected, and after his mother passed 2 years ago, he had grown into someone I barely recognized. "How was the hospital stay?" he asked, breaking the silence. "Dull," I admitted with a soft chuckle. "I'm glad to be out." "Well, you're with me now. I'll make sure you're comfortable," he said, glancing at me briefly before returning his focus to the road. His words were simple, but something about the way he said them made my breath hitch again. I remembered when I used to visit him after school, how his little face would light up when I brought him his favorite ice cream. We'd spend afternoons at the amusement park, laughing as we rode the Ferris wheel, his small hand gripping mine tightly whenever we went too high. It felt like a lifetime ago. "You've grown up so much," I murmured, not meaning for the words to slip out. He smiled softly. "You've said that a lot lately." "Well, it's true," I said, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from fidgeting. "You've been through so much, Julian. Your mom would be proud." His grip on the steering wheel tightened momentarily. "I hope so," he replied quietly. "I had to step up after she passed. There wasn't much of a choice." I looked at him, my heart aching for the boy he had been and the man he had become. "You didn't just step up. You thrived." He chuckled, a sound that was more bitter than joyful. "Maybe. But some days, it feels like I'm just surviving." The vulnerability in his voice hit me harder than I expected. Without thinking, I reached over and rested my hand on his arm. "You're not alone, Julian. I'm here." He glanced at my hand, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. The warmth of his skin beneath my palm sent a shiver through me, and when his eyes met mine briefly, something unspoken passed between us, something I wasn't ready to confront. When we arrived at my house, he parked the car and helped me out, his touch steady and reassuring. As we walked to the front door, I felt his arm around my waist, supporting me, and the memory of his small hand gripping mine all those years ago flashed through my mind again. Only now, it wasn't the hand of a boy, it was the hand of a man who had taken on the world and somehow come out stronger. Once inside, Julian guided me to the couch and grabbed a blanket, draping it over my legs. "Do you want some tea?" he asked, his gaze soft and attentive. I nodded, watching him move toward the kitchen. My living room, once a place of quiet solitude, now felt warmer with him in it. As I leaned back against the cushions, I couldn't help but wonder how we had ended up here. Two people, once bound by childhood memories, now navigating something much more complicated. When he returned with 2 cups of tea, he sat down beside me, closer than necessary. Our knees brushed, and I felt my pulse quicken. I took a sip of the tea, the warmth spreading through me, but it did nothing to calm the storm brewing inside. "I miss this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Spending time with you." I set my cup down, my fingers trembling slightly. "I missed it too." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The air between us felt thick, like the weight of unspoken words was pressing down on both of us. When I finally dared to look at him, his gaze was already on me, intense, searching, and filled with something I couldn't name. "I know things have changed," he said softly, "but that doesn't mean we have to lose this." "Lose what?" I wanted to ask, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. "You're right. We shouldn't." And as the evening stretched on, with the sun dipping below the horizon and casting shadows across the room, I realized that Julian wasn't just a reminder of my past. He was a part of my present, and possibly my future. Julian stretched out on the couch, his legs long and relaxed as he leaned back, one arm resting lazily on the cushions. The lamplight bathed the room in a soft golden hue, casting faint shadows that made everything feel softer, warmer. My fingers idly traced the rim of my now empty teacup as I glanced at the clock on the wall. 2:45 a.m. Where had the time gone? "You can stay if you want to," I offered, my voice casual, though my heart betrayed me with its quickened pace. "It's late, and I'd feel better knowing you weren't out driving at this hour." He grinned, that familiar mischievous spark in his eyes, making me feel like we were sharing a secret. "Is that your polite way of saying you want me to stay, Aunt Sophia?" I rolled my eyes, but the warmth spreading through me was undeniable. "Maybe. Or maybe I just want someone to help me with breakfast in the morning." He chuckled, shifting slightly so that his knee brushed against mine. The contact was fleeting, but I felt it like a spark beneath my skin. "If I stay, I make no promises about breakfast. But I am great company for late-night talks, apparently." "Apparently," I teased, setting my cup down on the coffee table and tucking my legs beneath me. "I don't usually stay up this late, you know. You're a bad influence." Julian smirked. "Well, you did say you miss spending time with me. Consider this my way of making up for lost time." I smiled softly, my gaze lingering on him a little longer than it should have. His presence filled the room in a way that made me feel less alone, as though the emptiness that had followed me home from the hospital had finally lifted. He wasn't just my nephew anymore. He was someone I could lean on, someone who had grown into a man I could talk to without pretense or fear of judgment. "So," he said, stretching his arms over his head and letting out a soft sigh, "you know about my failed relationships. What's your excuse? Why is my beautiful, smart aunt still single?" I laughed, shaking my head. "Beautiful and smart, huh? Flattery will get you everywhere." "Good," he said with a wink. "But seriously, what's the story?" I hesitated, running my fingers through my hair as memories of past relationships flickered through my mind like scenes from an old film. "I guess I just got tired," I admitted, my voice quieter now. "Tired of giving so much of myself and not getting the same in return. I've been divorced, you know that." Afterward, I tried dating, but it always felt like I was chasing something that didn't really exist. He nodded, his gaze steady and thoughtful. "Yeah, I get that. I mean, not the divorce part, obviously, but the exhaustion. It's like you hit a point where you can't keep pretending it's worth the effort." I smiled softly. "Exactly." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I think a lot of us settle for less because we're afraid of being alone. But you've never struck me as someone who's afraid of that." I considered his words, surprised by how well he understood me. "I wasn't always this way," I admitted. "When I was younger, I was terrified of ending up alone. But now, I'm not sure if it's strength or resignation." "It's strength," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the room like a warm breeze. "You've built a life for yourself. You don't need anyone to complete it." I didn't know what to say, so I simply nodded, letting his words settle over me like a comforting blanket. "What about you?" I asked after a moment. "Why haven't you found someone?" He laughed, but there was a bitter edge to it. "Oh, where do I start? I've dated women who saw me as a project they could fix, women who wanted the mature version of me without understanding that I'm still figuring things out. I guess I keep meeting people who want the idea of me, not the reality." I felt a pang in my chest. "That sounds lonely." "It is," he admitted, his voice softer now. But I've also learned a lot about what I don't want. Like, I don't want someone who sees me as a stepping stone to something else. I want someone who looks at me the way you do. My breath caught. The way I do. He smiled, but it wasn't playful this time. It was earnest. Yeah, like I'm enough as I am. You've never judged me, even when I've made mistakes. You see me, and that's rare. The air between us grew thick, the weight of his words pressing against my chest. I didn't know how to respond, didn't know if I should. But when he reached over and took my hand in his, the warmth of his touch grounded me, and I realized that maybe I didn't need to say anything. I'm sorry if this is weird, he said softly, his thumb brushing gently over my knuckles. I didn't mean to make things complicated. You haven't, I whispered, my voice barely audible over the sound of the ticking clock on the wall. Julian, you're one of the few people in my life who makes me feel alive. Like I'm more than just the woman who's been through too much. His gaze met mine, and for a moment, the world outside faded away. It was just us, two people who had shared laughter, grief, and now something much more intimate. He squeezed my hand gently. You are so much more than that. I smiled, my eyes stinging with unshed tears. You really are a bad influence, keeping me up until 3 a.m. and making me emotional. He laughed, leaning back but not letting go of my hand. I could sleep on the couch, or... I arched a brow, my heart racing. Or we could just keep talking. I like talking to you. I squeezed his hand back. I like it too. And so, with the night stretching on, we talked about everything and nothing. Our dreams, our fears, the people we had been, and the people we wanted to become. By the time the sun began to rise, I realized that whatever was happening between us wasn't something I could ignore. Julian had always been important to me, but tonight had shifted something fundamental. As he drifted off on the couch, his head resting on the armrest, I sat beside him, gently brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. The line we had once walked as aunt and nephew had blurred, and I wasn't sure where it would lead. But for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel afraid. Instead, I felt hopeful. The morning light streamed through the curtains, casting a warm, golden glow across the room. I stretched lazily, my body still recovering from the events of the previous night, or maybe from the emotional whirlwind Julian had stirred within me. The memories of our conversation still clung to me, as fragile and warm as the sunbeams dancing across the sheets. I hadn't slept much, but I didn't mind. It had been a long time since I felt that connected to someone. The smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, pulling me out of bed. I padded down the hallway, my feet bare on the cool floor, and found Julian standing at the stove, flipping pancakes like it was second nature. His hair was slightly tousled, a combination of bedhead and morning effort, and his t-shirt clung loosely to his frame, hinting at the strength beneath. "Morning, Auntie," he said, flashing me a grin over his shoulder. His voice was warm, teasing, as though we had a shared secret now, something unspoken but deeply understood. "Hungry?" I leaned against the doorframe, my arms crossed as I smiled at him. "Didn't we establish last night that you weren't making any promises about breakfast?" He shrugged, flipping another pancake before stacking it neatly on a plate. "I thought I'd surprise you. Plus, I figured you deserved it after letting me keep you up until 3 a.m. I walked over and grabbed a mug of coffee he had set out for me. "You're too good to me, Julian. Someone has to be," he said, his voice softer now. "Besides, I like taking care of you." My breath hitched, and I busied myself with stirring cream into my coffee, willing the heat in my cheeks to disappear. He wasn't just being sweet. There was a weight behind his words, an intention I couldn't ignore. I sat at the kitchen table as he brought over the pancakes, along with a bowl of fresh fruit and syrup. "Breakfast of champions," he announced, sitting down across from me. I chuckled, cutting into the stack. "You really went all out." "I wanted to impress you," he teased, winking. "Is it working?" I smiled, shaking my head. "You've always been impressive, Julian. You don't need to try." He seemed genuinely touched by that, and for a moment, we ate in comfortable silence, broken only by the clinking of utensils and the occasional hum of appreciation from me as I tasted the food. But as always, Julian wasn't content to let the moment stay too serious for long. "So," he said smirking, "are you going to wear that cute little sundress you have today?" I nearly choked on my coffee. "Excuse me." He leaned back in his chair, laughing. "What?" "I'm just saying, you have that one dress, the yellow one with the flowers? You always look great in it." I playfully swatted at him with my napkin. "Since when do you pay attention to my wardrobe?" He shrugged, grinning. "I've got eyes, Auntie." We continued joking back and forth until my stomach ached from laughing. I hadn't felt this light-hearted in so long. Being around Julian was like a breath of fresh air, like stepping out of a dim room and into the sunlight. But as the morning wore on, that warm bubble of comfort was suddenly interrupted by the buzzing of his phone on the table. He glanced at the screen, his brow furrowing for a moment before he answered. "Hey, man," he said, leaning back in his chair. I could only hear the muffled voice on the other end, but Julian nodded a few times before his gaze shifted back to me, and his expression brightened. "Oh, that's perfect," he said into the phone. "Yeah, we'll be there. Thanks for the invite." When he hung up, he placed his phone on the table and grinned at me, mischief glinting in his eyes. "Oh," I said, narrowing my gaze at him. "What's that look for?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "A friend of mine is having a party tonight. They said to bring someone fun." His grin widened. "So I told them I'd bring you." I blinked, momentarily stunned. "Me? Julian, I don't know a party. I haven't been to anything like that in years." "All the more reason to go," he said, his voice gentle but persuasive. "You've been cooped up in that hospital, and now you're finally free. Don't you think you deserve to let loose a little?" I bit my lip, the thought both thrilling and terrifying. But what kind of party is this? I don't exactly have the energy to dance on tables. He laughed, shaking his head. "Relax. It's not that kind of party. It's just a casual get-together. Some drinks, music, good company. Nothing wild." I hesitated, twirling a strand of hair between my fingers. "I don't know, Julian. I'm not sure what I'd even say to your friends." He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a soft, playful whisper. "You'll be fine. I'll be right there with you. In fact, I already figured out how to introduce you." "Oh." I arched a brow, curious. "And how exactly will you introduce me?" He leaned back, his grin turning slightly wicked. "As my girlfriend." I nearly knocked over my coffee. "You're what?" "My girlfriend," he repeated, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "Relax, Auntie. It's just for fun. But trust me, you'll fit right in. Everyone will love you." My pulse quickened, and I couldn't tell if it was from panic or excitement. "Julian, that's a terrible idea." "No, it's not," he said, his voice softening. "No one there will know you as my aunt. To them, you'll just be the amazing woman I'm lucky enough to spend my evening with." I felt my heart skip a beat. The way he said it, so sincere, so sure, made it hard to argue. And maybe he was right. Maybe I did need a little fun, a little adventure after everything I had been through. "Fine," I said, exhaling deeply. "I'll go. But if this gets weird, I'm blaming you." He grinned, triumphant. "Deal." As the morning sun continued to stream through the windows, I couldn't help but wonder what the night had in store. For the first time in a long time, I felt alive again. Nervous, yes, but alive. And as Julian reached across the table to give my hand a reassuring squeeze, I knew that whatever happened tonight, I wouldn't be facing it alone. The afternoon passed in a blur of indecision and nerves. I stood in front of my closet, staring at a chaotic pile of dresses and shoes strewn across the bed, feeling more unsure of myself with every passing minute. My hands trembled slightly as I held up another dress. Navy long-sleeved, maybe a little too conservative. I tossed it aside with a frustrated sigh. Why was this so hard? Why did it feel like everything depended on tonight? I sat on the edge of the bed, burying my face in my hands, willing the anxious thoughts to go away. I hadn't done this in years. The idea of stepping into a party, surrounded by strangers, and pretending to be carefree felt like climbing a mountain barefoot. Just as I was about to give up and call it off, I heard a gentle knock at my door. "Auntie? You okay?" Julian's voice was warm, soothing. A moment later, he peeked in, taking in the mess of clothes scattered around me. He smiled softly and stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "I'm a disaster," I said, my voice muffled by my hands. He sat beside me on the bed, the mattress dipping slightly under his weight. "No, you're not," he said, his voice low and reassuring. "You're just overthinking. It's just a party, not a runway show." I looked up, my eyes meeting his. He leaned forward, wrapping his arms around me in a comforting hug that instantly calmed my racing heart. "You could wear anything," he murmured against my shoulder, "and you'd be the most beautiful woman there." A blush warmed my cheeks as I pulled back slightly to meet his gaze. His sincerity was undeniable, and for the first time all day, I felt like I could breathe again. "Thank you," I whispered. He grinned. "Now how about I help you choose? What about that one?" He pointed to the milk-colored dress draped over the back of the chair. Short, tight-fitting, elegant, but with just the right amount of edge. I hesitated. "It's a bit much, don't you think?" Julian shook his head. "It's perfect. Trust me." I bit my lip, but something about the way he looked at me gave me the courage to try it on. A few minutes later, I stepped out of the bathroom, smoothing the fabric over my hips, my heart pounding as I waited for his reaction. Julian's eyes widened, and for a moment he said nothing. He stood there, taking me in from head to toe, his gaze lingering just long enough to make my breath hitch. "Wow," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'd really like you to be my girlfriend." I laughed, but the sound was nervous, fluttery. "You're just saying that because you're supposed to." "No," he said, stepping closer. His eyes met mine, dark and intense. "I'm saying it because it's true." Heat bloomed in my chest, but before I could respond, he flashed me a playful grin and stepped back. "Now it's my turn. Don't miss me too much while I get ready." I watched him leave the room, my heart racing. As I finished touching up my makeup, I heard him moving around in the other room, the faint sound of his cologne spritzing in the air. When he finally returned, my breath caught in my throat. He had dressed quickly but effortlessly. A black, tight-fitting shirt with the top 2 buttons undone, revealing just a hint of his chest. Black pants that hugged his frame perfectly. And that scent, his cologne, warm and intoxicating, wrapping around me like a spell. "You clean up nicely," I said, trying to sound casual, though my voice was slightly breathless. He smirked, closing the distance between us in 2 slow steps. "So do you?" Without another word, he held out his hand. His fingers were warm as they wrapped around mine, steadying me in a way that felt grounding. "Shall we, beautiful?" I nodded, allowing him to lead me to the car. He opened the door for me like a true gentleman, and as I settled into the seat, I couldn't help but glance at him. His profile was sharp in the glow of the setting sun, his jawline strong, his eyes focused on the road ahead. When he caught me staring, he smiled and reached over, gently brushing his fingers against mine. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded, my voice barely a whisper. "Yeah, I'm okay." When we arrived at the party, the sound of music and laughter drifted through the air, and I felt my nerves spike again. But Julian squeezed my hand, grounding me. "I'm right here," he said softly. "Let's just have fun." Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. People were chatting, dancing, and playing games around the patio and pool. It wasn't long before we were pulled into a game of beer pong. Julian was competitive but playful, his laughter infectious as he celebrated every shot he made. I was terrible at it, but the alcohol helped loosen me up, and soon I was laughing along with him, not caring about the score. But after my 3rd or maybe 4th drink, the room started to spin, and I stumbled slightly, grabbing Julian's arm for balance. "Oops," I giggled. He steadied me, his hands warm on my arms. "Okay, party animal," he said, laughing softly. "Let's get you some fresh air." He guided me outside to the quiet backyard, where the night air was cool against my flushed skin. We stood by the edge of the garden, the distant hum of the party fading into the background. I leaned against him, my head resting lightly on his shoulder as the alcohol buzzed through me. "Feeling better?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, closing my eyes for a moment. "Yeah, thanks for taking care of me." "I'll always take care of you," he said, and there was something about the way he said it, so soft, so sincere, that made me look up. Our eyes met, and the world seemed to fall away. His gaze dropped to my lips, and before I could think, before I could second-guess, his hand cupped the side of my face and he leaned in. His lips brushed against mine, soft at first, like a question. But when I didn't pull away, he deepened the kiss, his other hand slipping around my waist, pulling me closer. The warmth of him, the scent of his cologne, the way his lips moved against mine, it was dizzying, overwhelming, and yet exactly what I needed. When we finally pulled away, my breath came in shallow gasps, and Julian's forehead rested against mine. "I've wanted to do that for so long," he whispered. I smiled, my fingers curling around the fabric of his shirt. "So have I." We stood there for a moment, wrapped in each other, the night air cool but our bodies warm. And in that moment, I realized that whatever was happening between us was real, and I wasn't afraid to see where it would lead.